Okay, anytime. There we go. So, thank you, Carol. Well, we have Carol Meindl with us, who is the uh, not the executive director, excuse me, of the QFHSA. For those of you who don't know the acronym, it's the Quebec Federation of Home and School Associations. Thank you very much, Carol, for accepting our invitation and participating in this process.
My pleasure.
And we start out by asking some background questions for context, and then we move on to what I like to call the meat of the matter. So if we could start off by you telling me where your parents were born.
My parents were born in a small village called Magstadt in Germany in the mid to late 1920s. And they immigrated to Canada in 1951.
Okay, and where were you born?
I was born in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. My younger brother was as well, but my two older sisters were born in Toronto. That's where my parents chose to settle when they came to Canada, was in Toronto.
Okay, and where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
I received my education in Nova Scotia. I went to the New Germany Consolidated Elementary School. In 1965, it had just opened and all the one-room schoolhouses in Lunenburg County had closed and been consolidated into this elementary school. So I was one of, like, my older sisters, they were already 8 and 6 years old. For them to be jumping into this school was not a big deal, but for a lot of the other kids, they'd been coming from one-room schoolhouses to this school that had 500 kids. So it was different for them. And my high school was the New Germany Rural High School, which was fed by 3 elementary schools: New Germany, Springfield, and West Northfield. And it had about 500 students as well. And then I went to Acadia University in Wolfville, got my Bachelor of Arts in English Literature, minored in philosophy and fine art.
Okay, and what is your occupation now and any past occupations that you
Well, right now, I'm the executive director of the Quebec Federation of Home and School Associations, and I've been in that position now 10 years. Before that, in Nova Scotia, and a few years after I came to Montreal, about 6 years or so, I was a craftsman. I made China figurines. And I don't know if you can see them. That was my mushrooms.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah. And I made Father Christmas figurines. Anyway, so I did that for a good 20 years. And I just had to move my kiln here to Montreal, set up a studio, and I still shipped all my figurines to Nova Scotia because that's where my my customers were.
Right. Okay. And where do you live now?
Right now, I live in Côte Saint-Luc. When I first came to Montreal, I lived in Park Extension, and that in the late 80s was primarily a Greek neighborhood. So it was really kind of neat to be feeling like a minority, because I'd never felt that before. And it was just nice to not hear English all the time and see people from different cultures, different countries. I liked it. And then I lived in Snowdon for a few years. And then here in Côte Saint-Luc, I've been here now 27 years, almost half my life. Longer than I spent in Nova Scotia, which just seems bizarre, but true.
Okay, we're going to get into, as I like to call it, the meat of the matter. So these are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today.
Okay.
So start out with, what, in your experience at this moment in time, is the best thing about living in Quebec?
Montreal. I would say the international cuisine here, the variety of people in the streets and in the shops, the mixing of cultures and music, but that's Montreal. That's not necessarily Quebec. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing about Quebec that makes it especially wonderful. All provinces have their own scenic beauty and historical properties. So I'm kind of biased to Nova Scotia. I think it's the best. But I would say the best thing about Quebec is Montreal.
Okay. A lot of people, I should preface this next question by saying a lot of people have trouble with the next question, and I can understand it because I certainly would, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But then after you've answered the question, feel free to elaborate on your answer. So
Okay.
the second question is, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
I gave that some thought, and I thought the word best would be detached, which is a little ironic considering my profession right now.
Mm.
But what I could say is that when I first came to Montreal, I expected to be a Montrealer, live in Park Extension, maybe in some other neighborhood. I never really intended to become a Quebecer. I didn't even know how long I was going to stay in Montreal. I might have moved out another 5 years and gone to Toronto, but I stayed because I met my husband here and we made our home here. But if I had not actually got involved with the QFHSA, my little social network would have been my immediate neighborhood and my church community downtown. And all that was going on in politics would have been just on the peripheral of my life. And it wouldn't really have affected me. So I wouldn't have paid that much attention to it. That's why I say my relationship with Quebec is detached. I know it's out there. I get off the island every now and then, but I'm ambivalent really to Quebec.
Well, that
shoot me if you must.
Yeah, well, that kind of leads into the next question, and you quite possibly have already answered the next question, but for the record, I'm going to ask it anyway. Where do you feel most at home in Quebec, for example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I would say a little bit of all, because the geographical locations are the English-speaking neighborhoods. So certainly my Côte Saint-Luc neighborhood, NDG, my church community downtown, my home and school communities, when I go to the West Island, Eastern Townships. It's about the culture and about the language. That's where I feel most comfortable.
Okay. Now, again, I have to preface this next question based on the response I've been getting. A lot of people have asked me about the second part of this question, about the official definition of Quebec. Well, they say, Dave, official according to who? And my response to that is, it's all your perception. In other words, it could be the Quebec government's definition, it could be the Canadian government's definition, it could be the media's definition, it could be the definition of the zeitgeist out there, what you see in your neighborhood, whatever official definition of Quebec you choose. So having said that, I'll ask the two-part question. Excuse me. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
I would say the definition of a Quebecer should be someone who loves living here and is proud of it and wouldn't really want to be anywhere else. They bought in 100%. The official definition that I tend to get the feeling of is it has to be someone who speaks a Quebecois French, and they have to have a fairly long heritage of ancestors living in Quebec. And that's really sad because I don't necessarily get the feeling that any other province would make you feel that way. You know, if you choose to live in Alberta and you love it there, you're an Albertan. But in Quebec, it seems it has to do with language, and that's really too bad.
Yeah. So that leads me to the next question. Has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years?
Well, this kind of goes back to what I had said earlier, that when I first came to Montreal, I came with the intention of maybe being here for 5 years or so and getting a sense of this really wild and exotic city that was Montreal, and living in Park Extension and then in Côte Saint-Luc, which is a Italian and Jewish neighborhood. So I got another taste of cultures that I wouldn't have had before. But my whole social group would have been pretty confined. But because I got involved with the QFHSA and the Rights Committee and the Education Committee and the resolutions, I got a real sense of what the ramifications of a lot of the legislation that's being passed has, not only on the English community, but on immigrants and even on the French majority. And it did make me feel more like I have to choose a side of being either an English-speaking Quebecer or a Quebecois. And since I can never be a Quebecois, I will be an English-speaking Quebecer. And I have become more involved politically than I ever would have otherwise. The interesting thing is, though, once I possibly retire from QFHSA, I may just find myself drifting back into oblivion and just letting it all go on around me and not being involved with it at all, not let it touch me.
Okay, well, that leads us right into the next question. You're creating great segues here, Carol. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec in your experience?
I guess listening to the talk about Quebec values, which I feel are not necessarily the values of the actual people, but seem to be the values of the sovereigntists and the politicians in Quebec City. Because when you travel and you talk with people, they all seem very friendly, and they'll listen to your French and they seem to be eager to practice their English. But I think it's just listening to the rhetoric and the skewing of facts and the perpetuating of myths is just really, it's draining, it's wearisome.
Okay, the next question has been worded very carefully. I'm going to ask it. I think you understand the nuances of it. In recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you, number one, share and support? And number two, which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, first of all, I probably say I don't think it's the Francophone majority that has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. I think it's a very small minority of Francophones that are perpetuating these myths and stirring up the waters and getting people all upset. So, but I sympathize with the fear of losing the French culture. After all, Canada had to pass legislation for Canadian content in music and in the film industry. Otherwise, we'd all be just watching American stuff. I remember myself growing up watching Sesame Street and thinking, I have nothing in common with any of these kids. And it wasn't until we had Canadian Sesame Street that all of a sudden you started seeing your own neighborhood areas being depicted. So I get the sense that, sure, but you can't force your culture on anyone. You can't start banning certain things from YouTube in order to make more space for French, because you'll just create a counterculture and kids are going to go underground and listen to what they want to listen to. It just won't work. I understand their concern. And I have no problem with passing legislation to put a certain amount of, minimum Francophone material. But I have never believed that the English-speaking community of Quebec is any threat to the majority. I heard a statistic that said, in 1976, 80% of families in Quebec spoke French at home. And then in 2020, guess what? More than 80% of families speak French at home because it's mother tongue, it's what they speak. Not much has changed. Yes, in Montreal, it's changed. It has to change in Montreal. There's so much immigration coming in. It takes time to learn a language. It's usually the second or third generation that really embrace the culture of the new country that they've grown into. But yeah,
Okay.
I think that's the gist of it, is that there's no real threat to the linguistic majority in Quebec from the English-speaking minority. Yes, there's a lot of English in Canada, in the United States, and around the world, but you can't impose your culture and expect people to embrace it.
What is the biggest problem in your mind facing Quebec right now, and how in your mind do you think it could be resolved?
I think one of the biggest problems is misinformation. I think that the constant feeding the masses of conspiracy theories and myths and perpetuating the victim complex in Quebec, the putting the language, the French language, over everything else, including basic human rights. And the literacy rate in Quebec and the diminishing workforce. And the resistance to embracing immigrants and having them join the workforce. And what I really don't know what the solution is. Somebody would have to speak truth to power, someone that nobody could ignore. But then everyone would see the emperor has no clothes, and yeah.
Well, the next question I blatantly borrow from Guy Rogers' great documentary. He used it extensively, and I have, with his permission and in fact his input, I'm using it on the next question. On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being weakest, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, indicate by a show of fingers how strongly you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges.
Do I just show my fingers, or can I comment on?
You can comment, but I want you to show your fingers, please.
So if I really want to talk about how strongly I feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges. 2.
Fair enough.
But then I don't feel like I live in Quebec. I live in Montreal. If you were to ask me about Montreal, I'd say.
Okay, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
No, I think I actually already said it about how if I had not gotten involved with home and school, I wouldn't have expanded my knowledge of Quebec. I would have stayed in my own neighborhood between here and my church. I probably would never even get to the West Island, except if I went to the Fairview Mall. I certainly very rarely would get off the island into the Eastern Townships, apart from driving through it on my way to Nova Scotia. So I probably would never have gotten out to the Gaspé or anything like that. So I don't really have a sense of identity or living in Quebec. I don't belong to Quebec. I belong to Montreal, but I'm not a Montrealer. I'm a Nova Scotianer living in Montreal, enjoying it, but would not necessarily encourage my children to stay in Quebec. I've got 2 sons. One is very eager to move to Toronto, and the other one is going to go to the University of Montreal and perfect his French and stay in Quebec. So he will be a Quebecer, whereas my other son will be a displaced Montrealer in Toronto.
Okay, well, this concludes the official portion of the interview. What I'm going to do now, Carol, is I'm going to shut off the recording, but I'd like to continue the discussion if you don't mind, because I want to touch on some things you said. So